Okay, so in the last lecture, we found out about how World War I emerged and, more importantly, what America's role was within the war. Today, what we're going to talk about is a similar topic, but probably a lot more important. What I want to talk to you about today is the impact that World War I is going to make on American society here at home. Now, there's something that I want you to write down before I go any further. What World War I did, for the most part, is it expanded the role, the power, the authority, the scope, the reach, the size of the federal government. World War I made the federal government larger, it made it more powerful, and probably most importantly, it made it more noticeable in everyday American life. Let me give you a couple different reasons. When the United States got involved in the war, we saw the emergence of something called the Committee on Public Information. Those of you that have completed the quiz will note that there are a lot of posters in that folder that I asked you to look at to help you complete the quiz. Just about all those posters were commissioned by the Committee on Public Information. And so what I need you to understand about the CPI was it was started by the Woodrow Wilson administration as a way to generate support for the war. It quickly degenerated into more or less a propaganda machine. At first it was kind of cute, kind of funny things like they would take the Germanic sounding words, things like sauerkraut, and they would replace them with things like freedom cabbage because, of course, you didn't want to give the Germans too much credit in the way of the kind of food that we ate, right? But over the course of time, what you begin to see is this impulse to kind of force various forms of culture, 100% American culture, on groups of Americans. This ultimately leads to some of the two of the worst laws in American history. America's German population had always been large. I mean, even from the very beginning stages of American history, we have always had a very huge German population. Now, one of the things that we were worried about during World War I was that these German-born Americans were somehow giving away military, trade, agricultural secrets to our enemies. They were selling us out. And so one of the laws that we passed was something called the Espionage Act. 1917, what the Espionage Act it does is it gives the government more power to root out these spies or these supposed German spies in American life. And one of the ways that it gives the government more power to do that, ironically enough, is to spy on Americans. So if you're following along with me, we are trying to fight spies by sending more American government spies out into American life to root out the spies. The Espionage Act is a clear, unmistakable expansion of federal power, and I make the case that it's a dangerous expansion of federal power, considering you're giving the government quite a bit of power to monitor the behavior of the American people. It's alleged that it's a wartime emergency, but it's a difficult thing to take power back once power has already been given. Now, the only thing worse than the Espionage Act was the Sedition Act, which comes out a year later in 1918. And what the Sedition Act basically did was it banned what the government determined to be seditious speech. Talks, various forms of communication that were considered to be riotous or attempting to incite a riot, attempting to overthrow the American government in some loosely understood manner. In short, how I always have liked to think about the Sedition Act is it basically suspended the First Amendment. It suspended the right of free speech. Now, you might take a lot of dirty looks in doing this, but you can go right in front of the Student Service Building and you can scream, "I believe that the president is doing a terrible job and, you know, we should go ahead and impeach them," and so on and so forth. you would be well within your rights. Now, what the American government is saying is that because the war equates to a national emergency, we simply are going to have to sacrifice some of our more cherished rights, including that of free speech. Well, what you see the government do is arrest people that very well may have been trying to incite a riot, but at the same time they go after people that were politically unpopular. One really good example would be the industrial workers of the world. We've talked about them in this class before. They were quite radical. They had some very radical ideas, and when these government agents went out there and started looking for seditious speech, the IWW, which happened to be very anti-war and was very vocal in criticizing the American government's role in World War I, many of them just are simply arrested. And so there's a lot of political prisoners that are the victims of this Sedition Act. Okay. Anyway, back to life on the home front. One of the things that the American government had to do was to figure out how it was going to pay for the war. And to that end, what we got was the 16th Amendment. Okay. Now, what the 16th Amendment ultimately does is it puts an income tax on wealthier Americans and corporations. The good news about the 16th Amendment is most of us, probably not all of us, but most of us would have been able to avoid paying that income tax. It was largely targeted, wealthier Americans. But at the same time, you do see the expansion of the federal government, and as I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture, it has a tendency not to contract again, not to go backwards when it comes to expansion of power, and certainly we're going to see in World War II, actually, a revenue act that will put income taxes on pretty much everybody's income. Okay. So anyway, what I need you to understand is that the federal government is expanding, and although it's being said that this expansion has everything to do with the war, very few of these wartime measures are kind of backtracked in the aftermath. Another thing that we had to figure out if we're going to win this war was how do we give our soldiers the necessary equipment, the mechanisms to wage war? How do we put them on ships? How do we put guns in their hands, helmets on their heads, boots on their feet? And the simple fact of the matter was we needed to convert our peacetime economy, an economy that produced for civilians, an economy that produced things like cars and radios. Radios might be a bit premature, but you get the idea. How do we get them to produce things for the war? And one of the easiest answers we can point to is the emergence of the War Industries Board, the WIB. The WIB was really in charge of doing two things. One was allocating resources. It was in charge of making sure that our soldiers had the necessary equipment, but at the same time there was enough to go around for the civilian population. Okay, so allocating resources was a really big responsibility of the WIB. But so too was it when it comes to forcing private producers like Henry Ford, for instance, to switch over from civilian production to wartime production, even if they didn't want to. Now, don't feel too bad for Mr. Ford. The government made him an offer that he simply could not refuse. If you were Henry Ford and you were producing for the government, the military that is, you've got the best customer in the world, right? And not only do you have the best customer in the world, you've also got a monopoly on the best customer of the world. So Henry Ford, well, there might have been a lot of grumbling, a lot of, feet dragging in the beginning stages of this. Henry Ford got himself a pretty good deal when it comes to producing for the war rather than simply for a civilian consumer economy. What I need you to understand about the WIB is it basically guaranteed profits for corporations like Ford. Okay. Now, although the federal government had the power to tell people like Henry Ford, you must do this and we will make you do this, it really didn't want to have to use that power. A case in point, the Food Administration. The Food Administration was headed up by a guy that you'll be very familiar with by the time this class ends, a guy named Herbert Hoover. Okay? Now, Herbert Hoover had the power to basically tell Americans, look, I'm sorry, but you're just simply not going to be able to eat macaroni and cheese for the rest of the war. You won't be able to eat pizza. Pizza's probably a bad example considering it wasn't that mainstream of a food, but you get the point that I'm trying to make. Hoover didn't want to do this. Instead, what he did is appeal to something called voluntarism. Okay? He wanted Americans to voluntarily conserve resources, including food. And so what they did is they sponsored a campaign that came to be known as Food Will Win the War. And on Mondays, everybody agreed we're going to have meatless Mondays. Nobody in the United States will eat meat on Monday. Tuesday will be wheatless. Wednesday will be porkless. And together, what we're going to do is we're going to conserve the amount of food that we're eating, and therefore we'll be able to send more food over to our armies and the armies of our allies. And in a way, food did, in fact, win the war. Now, all of this really isn't going to amount to anything unless you've got people working inside those factories morning, noon, and night. I mean, you can have all the Henry Fords and all the Rockefellers and all the mainstream producers producing for the war effort, but if you don't have workers in those shops and factories morning, noon, and night, you're not going to crank out ships and guns and helmets and boots and, the lot of it. So my point is, just like the government gave corporate America a benefit from switching over from civilian production, they were going to have to throw the working class Americans a bone here. Okay. Now, if you think about what we've been talking about as far as Jurgis Rudkis and working class America, what would be one thing that you would really want from the government when it comes to getting you to not strike, not walk away from your job, work as much as humanly possible throughout the course of the war? One thing that I bet you're all saying right now is a union, right? You would want a union. Jurgis Rudkis wanted a union. He wanted a collective agency that could stand up and bargain on his behalf, that could negotiate with his employers, that would stand up for his rights on the factory floor. And that's essentially what the government gives to working class America during this time period. They said, look, if your boss accepts federal money for the war production, we guarantee that he will also recognize your union. And so what comes out of World War I is thousands and thousands and thousands of dues-paying, card-carrying union members. The other thing that comes out from the perspective of working class America are some expectations. And the expectation is, for the first time in American history, for the most part, the government has sided with the workers and allowed us to start forming unions, and the future is going to be bright. The expectation was that this happy relationship would continue on into the future and that things would be better for workers. Keep that thought in the back of your mind. The other thing I want to ask you is, who is working inside these factories? Now, of course, I know you're saying workers, but what kind of workers, considering most of the workers that were on the job in 1916 and a chunk of 1917, they all enlisted and they went over to fight the war. They're gone. They're not there anymore. So who's running our factories? The answer would be people that had pretty much been excluded up until this point. Many of you may know what I mean when I say the words Great Migration. The Great Migration consisted of African Americans and to a lesser extent Mexican Americans moving to the upper Midwest, to cities like Chicago, Detroit, moving especially to places like the Northeast, New York City, to a lesser extent the West Coast. But at any rate, African Americans are moving from the rural South, where the conditions, the social and political conditions, are absolutely oppressive. Black men can't vote in the South. If you were lucky enough to send your kids to school, it was a segregated school. In short, there's a lot of people that believe that there's a freedom in the North that exists that doesn't exist in the South, and they're more than happy to take advantage of these jobs that are available in the North. Chicago, New York, Detroit, they were all centers of wartime production, and the jobs that they offered paid triple, quadruple the amount of money that you could make as a sharecropper in rural Georgia or rural Alabama. And so the Great Migration is this transplanting of people from the South and to a lesser extent the Southwest into the urban North. Now that was one chunk of the people that were working in the factories. The other group would be women. Okay, women for one of the first times in American history get a taste of paid employment. Okay, now when we began this class, I was talking to you about this thing called the cult of true womanhood. How many Americans at the time believed that a woman's true place was in the home, raising children, guarding against their gentler virtues. That's going to change for obvious reasons during the war because there's a labor void. There's not enough men to go around, so it's going to be the women that go into the factories that are going to take these jobs that are, on the one hand, going to destroy this myth that women are the fairer sex and they can't handle heavy industrial work, and simultaneously give them a taste of, controlling their own money, controlling their own lives for the most part. And so I don't think it's a coincidence whatsoever that women get the right to vote in 1920 in the aftermath of this experience of producing for the war. If we're good enough to work in the sweatshop morning, noon, and night, we're certainly good enough to cast a ballot to determine who's the next senator or president is going to be. So every one of these groups that I've told you about, whether you're talking about African Americans, whether you're talking about workers, whether you're talking about women, just about all of them are looking at the future with high hopes and high expectations. Again, put that in the back of your mind as we're going through. There's another aspect of this time period that I want to make mention of before we move any further, and that would be a cultural aspect. Modernism. Modernism was an international movement that was really beginning to emerge even before the war broke out, and it was emerging not in the United States but actually in Europe. Okay. Now, many of the influences of modernism include things like industrialization, urbanization, but after the war got going, it was really World War I that made a big imprint on the cultural expressionists of this particular time period. Let me give you one really good example, one example that I bet you're pretty familiar with, whether you read the book or saw the movie. A guy by the name of F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote this really famous book called The Great Gatsby. And what many of you probably associate with Gatsby, in addition to Leonardo DiCaprio, is probably these lavish parties that he throws, the expensive things in his house or the house itself, things, right? But if you dig deep into that film or that book, you'll find that one of the things that Fitzgerald is primarily concerned about is this consumer culture that has emerged in the United States in the 1920s. It's a rejection of this consumer culture. Now, you could make the case for Fitzgerald, but you could also make the case for people like Ernest Hemingway. There's a lot of these people, whether they be artists or photographers or writers or to some extent musicians, that were deeply, deeply, deeply affected by their experiences in World War I. And keep in mind, at least in the story, Gatsby is a veteran. The main characters in Hemingway's Farewell to Arms, they're veterans of World War I. And so this is a really important period when it comes to cultural expression, because we're moving away from that Victorian era culture that we've been talking about a little bit as the class began. We're beginning to merge into more of a modern kind of culture. Now, back to these expectations. Part of the Great Migration meant you were taking control of your life. You were voting with your feet, in essence, I guess. We've had it with how the South treats us as African Americans, and we're not going to take it anymore. We're leaving Georgia, and we're headed for Chicago. When African Americans arrived in the North, they found that there was more freedom, more opportunity, but there were also very racist attitudes, very similar to what they had left in the South. Good example of that was what happened in East St. Louis in 1917. In East St. Louis, there were riots that broke out amongst primarily white people because they felt that African Americans were being given preferential treatment when it comes to hiring in defense factories. And these armed white mobs would invade known black communities and beat people up indiscriminately, just beat them within an inch of their life. And in an earlier time period, when the Ku Klux Klan would go on a night ride or something like that, basically the way that the African American community reacted was to run and hide. Clearly, they had the numbers, they had the guns, and the best solution would be to lay low while this whole thing blows over. That was certainly not the reaction in places like East St. Louis, Missouri, in 1917. We're talking about a time period where you see the emergence of something called the New Negro. Now, that's not a slur or any kind of derogatory terminology whatsoever. Historians use the term New Negro to describe this newfound racial assertiveness that is being witnessed in the African American community. Part of this new racial assertiveness goes back to the experience in fighting in World War I. If we're good enough to take a bullet for Uncle Sam, we're good enough to sit in any lunch counter. If we're good enough to work in a defense factory, we're good enough to cast a ballot. If we're good enough to respect ourselves enough to remove ourselves from a place like Georgia, we're good enough to be treated as first-class citizens. And so when white mobs would invade the black community, black people didn't just run and hide, they fought back. And this was a completely different vision of African American protest. It had not been seen before. Same thing happened in Chicago in 1919, a couple of years later. You had race riots broke out, basically, without getting too far into this, because there's a lack of recreation. When all these newcomers, these transplants, found their way to a place like Chicago, they put extreme amounts of strain on civic resources. Housing shortages, recreational shortages, in some cases job shortages, and all of these groups are competing against one another for these things. And so there are naturally these antagonisms that existed between the white and black community in a place like Chicago. But when you would have these white mobs that would invade the south side of Chicago, African Americans didn't simply roll over and take it. They fought back. They gave as good as they got, so to speak. And this new Negro attitude is paramount in the race riots of what could loosely be called the war years. Now, 1919 is an important year for organized labor as well, labor generally speaking. Remember how I told you that one of the things that came out of the war was thousands and thousands of new union members? Well, in the aftermath of the war, the Wilson administration basically said, look, if you want to keep your unions in your shops, you can. If you don't want them, you don't have to keep them. It's completely up to you. As you might imagine, most of the employers said, we don't want to keep them, and they pretty much told their workforce, you can either disown your union membership or you can find another place to work. And of course, as you can imagine, this very much angered working class America, the people that had fought so hard to form these unions. And so 1919 is a really tumultuous, very chaotic year when it comes to the history of working class America. You see work stoppages all across the board. In Seattle, for instance, they implemented something called a general strike, which meant that on one particular day in 1919, nobody in Seattle went to work, or everybody in Seattle refused to work. They basically shut down the city. 1919 is important for another reason, because that's the year that the Russian Communist Party forms this thing called the International, or the Comintern. Now, I don't need you to hang on my every word here. I'm never going to test you about European history, but what I will point to when it comes to the issue of communism, it's not going to work if it just stays in Russia. The point of communism is to produce this classless utopia, this perfect society where everybody has enough to eat and everybody has enough clothes to wear and everybody has enough shelter, and the list goes on and on and on. In order to do that, you have to have government control of the means of production. So the government's going to own things like the railroads or the communication networks or the factories or the banks, and again, the list goes on and on. If it just stays in Russia, it's not going to work, because the problems are going to go to places like France and Germany. Eventually, they're going to go to South America, North America, Africa, the Middle East. So the point of communist revolution is not just to have a revolution in one country or even a handful of countries, it's to export communism to every corner of the globe. So what the Russians are trying to do is give communism to the rest of Europe, to Africa, to Asia, to the Americas, all across the world. And that's what the Comintern was designed to do. It was designed to export communism into every corner of the world. And in 1919, communism came to the United States. The American Communist Party, the CPUSA, was born in Chicago, 1919. Now, the stated mission of the Communist Party was the overthrow of the American government. What they wanted to do was overthrow the American government by any means necessary, violence included, and implement a communist regime similar to what happened to Russia in 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution. Well, if you're a power that is, you're an attorney general or something like that, and you're watching all of these workers fighting with their bosses in places like Seattle, you take that and you couple it with what the Communist Party says it's doing, right? It looks like class warfare. It looks like class conflict. Take that and add into what happened to the Attorney General's house in 1919, and you really had the making of a firestorm, okay? The Attorney General was a guy named A. Mitchell Palmer, and in 1919, a bomb exploded outside of his home. Now, fortunately for the Palmers, nobody was really hurt, but as far as Palmer himself was concerned, this could only be the work of communists. And so what he does in the aftermath of his house being bombed is he sends hundreds of federal agents, again, the expansion of the government. He sends them into American life in what comes to be known as the Palmer raids. All these federal agents are just pouring into American society, and they're arresting people in kind of like a dragnet fashion. In other words, people that really didn't have much to do with anything as far as the bombing is concerned, they're arrested, they're brought in for trial, some of them are thrown back, some of them are detained, okay? Matter of fact, Palmer felt so strongly that the behavior of specific Americans needed to be monitored much more closely that he ultimately set up this affiliated agency in the Justice Department. You call it the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI. The FBI is eventually going to be ran by another Leonardo DiCaprio film here, going to be ran by a guy named J. Edgar Hoover, not to be confused with Herbert Hoover. Okay, J. Edgar Hoover would get his start under A. Mitchell Palmer, and what really put these people on the map was the Red Scare of 1919. We were certain that communism was right around the corner in the United States, that the communists were going to do to the Americans what they had done to the Russians a couple of years earlier. And we were going to make sure that we were going to stamp it out, even if that meant an infringement upon civil rights and civil liberties. Now, this is not going to be the last time that we're going to talk about a Red Scare, this intense fear of communism, radicalism generally speaking. We're going to see it flare up in the 1950s when we talk about the second Red Scare. And again, communism is going to be central in that discussion. But for the time being, I need you to understand that even after the war, we've got the expansion of the government, because one of the things that we're very worried about are these things coming from the outside of the world, in particular Europe, and influencing how we live our lives as Americans. Last case in point about this anti-radical, anti-immigrant sentiment that's beginning to sweep across the United States in the aftermath of World War I. Two individuals, both of whom were Italian immigrants, Niccolò Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti. These guys were Italian immigrants. Now, when I say Italian immigrants, I mean they never applied for American citizenship. They were also self-professed anarchists, people that wanted to destroy the American government. Now, in 1920, both men were accused of robbing and murdering a paymaster, their boss, in Massachusetts. Now, they go on trial, and even though there's evidence that surfaces that suggests, at least, that these two men are innocent. The judge that oversaw the trial is not allowing that into court. And so the Sacco and Vanzetti trial, for your notes, it becomes much more about, look, did you know that these two guys are not American? Did you realize that they're anarchists? Do you know what anarchism involves? Clearly they're violent. Clearly they must be capable of committing murder. And so at the end of the day, the government, or at least the prosecuting attorney, never really had a lot of concrete smoking gun evidence that implicated Sacco or Vanzetti when it comes to this murder trial. But nonetheless, they're convicted, and in 1927, they're executed via the electric chair. And so what I'd need you to understand about the Sacco and Vanzetti case is that it was very much reflective, it was very much emblematic of this anti-radical, anti-immigrant sentiment that's sweeping across the United States at the end of World War I. As we begin the 1920s, our discussion of the 1920s, you're going to see this movement to become 100% American. And you're going to see various things ranging all the way from baseball to the Ku Klux Klan that are, working sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly to enforce what they saw as traditional, quote-unquote, American values. I'm going to leave it right there. We're approximately, for those of you that are trying to follow me on the chronological timeline, we're approximately at the year 1920, and that's going to be a good dividing point between Unit 1 and Unit 2 when it comes to our class. The next time I meet with you, we're going to be talking about the emergence of the 1920s and this new attitude and culture as it relates to American politics.